I remember the exact spot where my father said those words. It happened during my niece's graduation celebration. The entire family had gathered in the backyard, picnic tables everywhere, balloons tied to chairs, and those uncomfortable plastic folding seats that always dig into your legs. Everyone was laughing, eating, drinking, and celebrating her full scholarship to Stanford. My father, Gerald, wearing his usual khaki shorts and old veteran's cap, raised his glass proudly and gave a toast about how far the Kalin family name had come. He always talks like that, the Kalin name, as if we belong to some powerful dynasty instead of being an ordinary middle-class family from Pennsylvania that eats far too much potato salad at reunions. I walked over carrying a plate of food, smiling the way I always do. That's the role I've been given in this family, the quiet one, the peacemaker, the black sheep who keeps her head down and avoids conflict. Beside me stood my son, Elias, quiet and respectful, trying to disappear inside his hoodie. I truly was proud of my niece, but at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Elias. He was just as intelligent, maybe even smarter. He had recently been accepted into 3 excellent universities, and he earned every bit of it through hard work. He balanced school, a part-time job, and helping me take care of my mother during chemotherapy treatments. He never had expensive tutors or private SAT coaching. What he had was determination. What he had was me. So, as casually as possible, I leaned toward my father and asked, "Dad, does Elias get any of the college fund too?" Gerald never even lifted his eyes from his plate. He simply shook his head and muttered, "Why waste it on him? He's from a broken home." Something inside me cracked at that moment. Not because I hadn't heard crueler things before. I had. Not because Elias hadn't already been treated differently. He had. But it was the ease of it, the casual way he said it, like he was stating an obvious fact everyone should already understand. Like it belonged in a textbook somewhere. It broke apart something I had been forcing myself to hold together for 17 years. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't create a scene. I just smiled and stayed silent, exactly the way I always had. But inside, I was furious. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elias had been preparing a speech. He had been chosen valedictorian of his senior class, and he was planning to speak at graduation. He never told anyone, not even me, what he intended to say. But the moment he stepped onto that stage in his cap and gown, gripping the microphone with slightly trembling hands, I could feel that something important was about to happen. I just had no idea how powerful it would be. And when he delivered his final line, I turned toward my father. Even Gerald Kalin, the same man who once told me I ruined the family's reputation by getting divorced, rose from his seat. Not to applaud, but out of complete shock. But before I tell you what Elias said, you need to understand something first. You need to understand what it feels like to raise a child inside a family where love comes with conditions attached. A family where tradition matters more than honesty, and where carrying the Kalin name only gives you value if you fit neatly into their expectations. My name is Naomi. I'm a single mother, a librarian, and a daughter who never quite succeeded in making her father proud. And this is the story of how my son, my quiet, thoughtful, constantly underestimated son, did something nobody expected, including me. This is the story of what he said on that stage, and why that single moment changed everything. What nobody ever saw about my son began long before the graduation party. Long before the college acceptance letters arrived. It really started 17 years earlier, inside a cramped hospital room where I held him in one arm while signing divorce papers with the other. Elias entered this world during the darkest period of my life. My marriage collapsed faster than I ever imagined possible. My ex-husband, Ryan, cheated on me while I was pregnant. 2 months before Elias was born, he moved out, and ever since then, he has never been consistent. Not as a father, not even as a voice over the phone. Occasionally, he sends birthday messages. That's about all. My family didn't react well to the divorce either. My mother cried more over the end of my marriage than she did when her own sister passed away. My siblings, Catherine and Joel, barely spoke to me for quite some time. And my father, Gerald, hardly said anything at all. Just one sentence I've never forgotten. "Well, you made your bed." Maybe I did. But I made another bed too. one for Elias, and I made sure it was warm, safe, and filled with bedtime stories. Because from the moment he opened his eyes, that little boy became my entire world. We never had much money, but we had each other. I worked as a librarian, which certainly wasn't a path to wealth, but I genuinely loved the job. After school, Elias would come sit with me at the library, quietly tucked into the children's section reading every book he could get his hands on. By the age of 8, he was already reading at a 10th grade level. By 10, he was writing short stories, so moving they brought me to tears. Not only because they were beautifully written, but because they came from such a quiet, observant child who rarely asked for anything, yet seemed to feel everything deeply. He never complained about wearing thrift store clothes. He never questioned why we couldn't take vacations like his cousins did. And not once did he mention the way our family treated him differently, even though they absolutely did. Catherine and Joel's children always had seats at the adults' table during family dinners. Elias, meanwhile, sat with the little kids even when he was 14 years old. At Christmas, the other kids opened gift cards and video games. Elias opened socks. One Christmas, Gerald even forgot to write his name on the stocking. Elias acted like it didn't affect him, yet I noticed every little sign. I saw it in the way he carefully folded his napkin 3 separate times before he started eating, in how he always waited for everyone else to talk before saying anything himself, and in the journal he constantly carried in his pocket, filling its pages with thoughts he never felt comfortable speaking aloud. There were moments when I wanted to shake my entire family and shout, "Can't you see him? Don't you realize how extraordinary he truly is?" But I stayed silent because part of me believed that, eventually, if I waited long enough, they would finally understand. They never did. The only person who genuinely recognized Elias for who he was happened to be my mother, Doreen. She would sit beside him for hours, listening to his stories with patience and warmth, always calling him her little professor. Even during her final year, when chemotherapy drained nearly all her strength, her face would still brighten the instant Elias entered the room. She once told me he reminded her of someone me, back when I was young, before life became noisy and before I learned to make myself smaller just to fit my family's expectations. When my mother passed away, Elias was only 15 years old. He never cried in front of anyone. Yet later that evening, I discovered one of his poems tucked carefully inside her Bible. The title alone shattered me. The Last Woman Who Saw Me. After she was gone, it became just the two of us, me and Elias, trying to survive within a family that constantly made us feel like background characters in a story centered around them. Still, despite years of being ignored, undervalued, and dismissed, he never became bitter. He focused on studying, helping others, and writing. By the time senior year arrived, he had already applied to colleges without asking me for a single dollar, and he was accepted into every one of them. So yes, when my father casually asked, "Why waste it on him?" I simply smiled and stayed quiet. But that smile was never surrender. It was a promise. Because the thing they failed to recognize, the thing they had never truly seen, was that my son was about to reveal exactly who he was. And deep down, I knew with certainty that once that moment arrived, none of them would ever forget it. Some moments in life do more than hurt. They leave permanent marks. They cling to your memory, your voice, even your skin, and you carry them silently for years. The moment in my father's backyard, when he reduced my son's future to a single cruel sentence, became one of those moments for me. Why waste it on him? He's from a broken home. He didn't say those words with anger or hostility. He said them as casually as someone commenting on the weather, as though Elias's value had already been measured and decided. I looked over at my son, frozen halfway through his meal, his fork hovering above a flimsy paper plate filled with ribs and potato salad. He didn't cry or react. He simply lowered his eyes and continued eating, only much slower than before. In that instant, I wanted to snatch Gerald's drink and dump it in his lap. I wanted to stand up and scream, "You don't know anything about him." But experience had already taught me that defending yourself in this family only gave them another excuse to dismiss you. So I stayed in my chair, smiling on the outside while fury burned inside me. Later that night, I found Elias sitting in his room, typing quietly at his computer. I asked him how he was doing. He answered with a simple, "Fine." Then, after a pause, he looked at me and asked, "Do you think it's true?" That question wounded me far more deeply than anything Gerald had said. Sitting beside him on the edge of the bed, I took a slow breath before replying, "No, baby. The broken thing isn't you. It's the way they choose to see the world." He nodded slightly, but I could still see uncertainty lingering behind his eyes. I knew he had already stored that moment away, adding it to the collection of thoughts he never dared to say aloud. After that night, something inside Elias changed. He began pushing himself harder than ever before, sleeping less, and working constantly. He had always been intelligent, but now determination had turned into obsession. Every scholarship opportunity, every writing competition, every extra credit assignment, he chased after all of them like his life depended on it. And I couldn't stop worrying that he wasn't running toward success at all. He was running away from pain. One afternoon, I got home from work earlier than usual and heard him crying behind the bathroom door. The sound wasn't loud, just soft, muffled sobs, like he was fighting to keep them buried inside. I couldn't bring myself to knock. Instead, I sat on the floor outside the door for nearly 20 minutes, my hand pressed against the cold tile, my chest tight with guilt. All I could think was, how many times have I allowed him to feel abandoned simply because I was too afraid to disturb the peace? But little by little, I began noticing a change in him. He started writing again, not only for assignments at school, but for himself. He stayed late after class with his English teacher, who later told me that Elias was extraordinary. She said he wasn't just intelligent, he mattered, and his words carried real power. One evening during dinner, Aaliyah casually announced, "They chose me for valedictorian." I nearly dropped my fork. Not because I doubted him, he had earned every bit of it, but because I understood the weight of that moment. It wasn't only about the title or the recognition. It meant standing at the microphone on a stage, in front of the same people who had spent years treating him like he was less than everyone else. I asked him quietly, "What are you planning to say?" He smiled, though the expression never fully reached his eyes. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted, "but I think I want them to actually hear me this time. Really hear me." And in that instant, everything changed. This was no longer about college money or Gerald opinions. This was about Elias finally finding his voice after spending 17 years being ignored in rooms that were supposed to love him. As graduation grew closer, I kept hoping someone in the family would reach out. A congratulations, a text, anything at all. But nothing came. Catherine posted photos of her daughter's prom dress. Joel uploaded pictures of his new grill. Yet not one person mentioned Elias. Not once. The strange thing was, he no longer cared about their approval. His entire focus was on the speech. Even though he never allowed me to read it, I could see the fire in him every time he worked on it. He rewrote lines over and over, whispering sentences under his breath when he thought nobody was listening. He was creating something powerful, something that felt destined to strike the room like thunder. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't be polite or comfortable. It would be the truth. The days before graduation carried a strange feeling, not bad exactly, but tense, like the silence before a storm breaks open. Elias seemed calm, though not the peaceful kind of calm. It was the stillness of someone carrying a mission inside him, something waiting beneath the surface for the right moment to rise. Whenever I asked how the speech was coming along, he'd give me that familiar half-smile, the one he used whenever he didn't want to lie but also couldn't reveal everything. "It's getting there," he'd say. "I just want it to matter." That word stayed with me, matter, because I knew exactly what he meant. He wasn't writing this speech just to satisfy the school administration or decorate a college application. He wanted to speak directly to everyone, especially to us. He was exhausted from feeling invisible. The night before graduation, I found him sitting alone on the porch with his journal resting in his lap, staring up at the stars. In that moment, he looked younger somehow, like the little boy who once asked me whether trees could feel emotions. I sat beside him and quietly said, "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Without taking his eyes off the sky, he answered, "If I don't say it now, then when will I?" I nodded slowly. Then say everything. After that, we sat together in silence. He didn't need encouragement or speeches from me. What he needed was the freedom to stand in his truth, and I refused to stand in his way anymore. Earlier that week, I had emailed the entire family the graduation details, the time, location, and seating information. Nobody replied. Not a single response. Not even a simple "will try to come." I wasn't shocked, but I was furious. This was one of the biggest moments of his life, and they treated it like it was just another ordinary Thursday. On the morning of the ceremony, Elias stepped out of his room, wearing his cap and gown. He looked polished and confident, like someone born to stand before a crowd. I lifted my phone to take a picture, but he never smiled. "You ready?" I asked. He straightened his tie and answered, "I've been ready." When we arrived at the school auditorium, the place was overflowing with families. Parents fanned themselves with programs while teachers smiled proudly at the students they had watched grow up. I scanned the crowd while searching for our seats, and then I saw them. The family. Gerald sat there in his neatly pressed shirt and veteran's cap. Catherine had her arms folded tightly across her chest. Joel stared down at his phone. They were all seated together in the third row as if they had somehow earned the privilege of witnessing a success they had never helped build. I didn't acknowledge any of them. I simply walked Elias backstage and squeezed his hand. "No matter what you say up there," I whispered, "I'll always be proud of you." He nodded once. There wasn't fear in his eyes, only determination. Back in my seat, I could hardly breathe. The ceremony began with the usual announcements: honor students, scholarships, awards. Then the principal stepped onto the stage and introduced Elias as the valedictorian, listing his GPA, his scholarships, and his acceptance into Northwestern University. Behind me, I could hear the family murmuring in surprise, making soft, impressed noises, as though they had never imagined he could accomplish something so extraordinary. Then Elias walked onto the stage. My son stood tall with his shoulders back and his chin lifted high, his journal clutched firmly in his hand. Right away, I noticed he wasn't using the approved speech from the podium. Instead, he opened his journal, turned a page, and looked out across the crowd. At first, he thanked the teachers, the students, and the staff, the usual beginning everyone expected. But then the atmosphere in the room changed completely. He paused for a long moment, stared directly into the audience, and said, "There are people sitting in this room today who never expected me to make it here. People who believed I wasn't worth investing in. People who thought that because I came from a broken home, I had to be broken too. Yet over time, I came to understand something important. You do not need to be raised in a perfect family to create a meaningful and powerful future for yourself." A quiet ripple swept through the crowd as his words settled over the room. My heartbeat pounded heavily in my chest while he continued speaking, calm and unwavering, his eyes fixed on the very people who had spent years trying to make him feel invisible. "Some people are born into applause," he said steadily. "Others have to fight for every single clap they receive. But that does not make us lesser. It makes us stronger." I turned toward my father. There was no smile on his face, no applause from his hands. He simply sat there with his arms crossed tightly and his lips pressed together. Good. Let him sit with that feeling, because Elias was far from finished. And suddenly, I understood something clearly. This was not revenge, nor was it rebellion. It was reckoning. There are moments in life when a person finally steps into who they truly are, and everything around them seems to slow. The air feels heavier, the silence deeper, the atmosphere charged with something undeniable. That was exactly what filled the room as Elias stood there with his journal open, his eyes focused on the audience before him. He was not simply reading words from a page. He was speaking his truth, carrying every ounce of quiet resilience he had built through years of being ignored and underestimated. "There were people," he continued softly, "who told my mother that I would never be enough. People who believed she failed simply because she raised me on her own. But she never failed me. She fought for me. She taught me how to stand tall without needing applause. She taught me how to work hard when nobody was watching and how to believe in myself when the people who should have believed in me never did." You could feel the atmosphere changing. Parents and teachers leaned forward in their seats. Some gasped quietly. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Still, my family remained motionless. Gerald's face stayed cold and unreadable. Catherine glanced nervously in his direction, while Joel leaned back in his chair as though he refused to admit he was emotionally affected by any of it. But Elias never hesitated. He stood there with the calm confidence of someone who no longer had anything to prove, yet still had everything to say. For years, he continued, I convinced myself that silence meant peace. I thought if I stayed quiet and kept my head down, maybe I would finally earn my place. Maybe if I worked hard enough, I would stop feeling like a visitor inside my own family. My hands trembled in my lap as I listened. Then Elias spoke the words that seemed to strike every heart in the room. I finally realized something, he said. You cannot sit around waiting for permission to exist fully in this world. You take your place. You create it. You own it. I glanced around the auditorium. Parents nodded slowly in agreement. Students whispered among themselves. Several teachers brushed tears from their cheeks. Then Elias closed his journal. When he lifted his head again, his eyes no longer wandered across the audience. They locked directly onto one person with razor-sharp focus, Gerald. And then he delivered the line that silenced the room completely. I grew up in what people call a broken home, he declared. But broken homes do not create broken people. They create fighters. They create listeners. They create leaders. They create sons who one day stand in rooms like this and make even the quietest people listen. The words crashed through the auditorium like thunder. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Nobody clapped. It felt as though the entire room inhaled at once. Then the applause erupted. It came in waves. People rose to their feet, not out of politeness, but because they understood they had witnessed something far greater than an ordinary graduation speech. And then something unexpected happened. Gerald stood up. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly. Hesitantly. As if even he was unsure whether he truly intended to rise. But he did. And for the briefest second, something in his expression cracked open. It was not pride. Not yet. It was not a smile or tears either. Just the faintest flicker of realization buried behind his eyes. Maybe shock. Maybe guilt. Maybe shame. Whatever it was, Elias did not need his approval anymore. He had already won. After the ceremony ended, I walked with Elias toward the car. I expected excitement, adrenaline, maybe even celebration. Instead, he seemed peaceful, thoughtful, as though a storm had finally passed and calm waters had taken its place. You okay? I asked quietly. He nodded once. Yeah. I didn't say any of it to hurt him. I know, I replied softly. You said it to heal yourself. A small smile touched his face. And maybe, he added, someone sitting in that audience needed to hear it too. That sentence broke something open inside me because it captured exactly who Elias had always been. Never cruel, never bitter, just incredibly brave. Later that night, a text message came from Gerald. He surprised me. I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused months earlier. But somehow I realized I no longer needed it. Elias had already spoken every truth that needed to be heard, and this time, the world actually listened. What my son revealed about dignity and self-worth stayed with everyone in that room. You would think that after a moment like that, after your son stood before a crowd and exposed the truth to people who had spent years acting as though he barely existed, everything would suddenly change. But it didn't. At least, not outwardly. Gerald never called me afterward. He didn't walk over once the ceremony ended. He never embraced Elias, never said, "I'm proud of you," and certainly never admitted, "I was wrong." That kind of honesty would have demanded a level of humility he had never possessed. Instead, he sent a text message. Just 3 words. No punctuation. No emotion. Yet somehow, those words carried more weight than every speech he had ever delivered at those loud family cookouts. For Gerald Kalin, it wasn't an apology. It was simply the first crack in a wall he had spent years building. Maybe not redemption, but perhaps the beginning of an opening. Even so, I never replied, because this story was never really about him. That evening, Elias and I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, eating takeout while replaying his graduation speech from an Instagram story someone had uploaded online. A stranger had recorded the entire thing and posted it with the caption, "Best graduation speech I've ever heard. This kid is destined for greatness." By then, the video already had thousands of views. I glanced at Elias and smiled softly. "That's your legacy now," I told him. He shrugged casually. "It was only a speech." "No," I answered. "It was a declaration." For a moment, he stayed quiet. Then he finally spoke. "I didn't do it for him," he said. "Or for any of them." "I know," I whispered. "I did it for us," he continued. "For the version of myself that used to believe he had to make himself smaller just to fit inside this family." That was the moment everything truly hit me. This entire journey began with me trying to protect Elias from ever feeling unworthy. Yet somehow, in the end, he became the person who taught me what being whole actually meant. I had spent years craving validation in silence, trying not to upset my father, trying not to shame the family, trying not to make life even harder for Elias than it already was. I believed that if I stayed quiet enough and small enough, eventually they would make space for us. But Elias never wanted a seat at their table. He built one of his own. In the weeks following graduation, something inside him changed. There was a calmness about him I had never seen before, a deep confidence rooted firmly beneath the surface. It was as if a storm had torn through him and left strength standing in its place. He packed for college with excitement instead of fear. He walked away from his childhood bedroom as though he were closing one chapter of life, not mourning something lost. He wasn't escaping the family that overlooked him. He was stepping toward the future he created for himself, one decision, one step, and one word at a time. And as for me, I finally stopped waiting for approval. I stopped sending family pictures nobody ever asked to see. I stopped hoping Gerald would suddenly wake up one morning and recognize me as a daughter worth loving openly. I stopped exhausting myself trying to explain my son's brilliance to people too blind or too proud to appreciate it, because I no longer needed their recognition. The world already saw him clearly. A few months into his first semester at college, Elias called me from his dorm room. "Guess what?" he asked excitedly. "What happened?" I laughed. "I just won the freshman writing award." I smiled instantly. "Of course you did. What was the essay about?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "It was about being raised by a woman who taught me I mattered long before anybody else ever did." I cried right there in the middle of the grocery store, standing between the apples and the peanut butter aisle. Because that's the true ending of this story. Not revenge. Not validation. Not even pride. Love. The kind of love that remains steady and gentle, refusing to disappear even when the world tries to convince you that you are unworthy. The kind of love that raises a boy into a man so certain of his own value that even rejection cannot destroy it. The kind of love that never needed wealth or a college fund to survive. Only belief. So, if anyone has ever made you feel smaller because of your family, if someone has tried to define you by your pain, your scars, or your past, remember this. Broken homes do not create broken people. They create survivors. They create fighters. They create storytellers. They create sons like Elias and mothers like me. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own life or someone you deeply care about, don't keep it to yourself. Share the video with someone who may need these words. Leave a comment below and tell your story too. Every voice deserves to be heard. And whenever we speak our truth, we don't only heal ourselves, we remind other people they are not alone. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories that are honest, emotional, and real, subscribe and become part of this community. Because here, we do not believe in broken people. We believe in comeback stories. Thank you for watching. I'm truly glad you were here.